First, let me say what a great pleasure it is to welcome all of you to the GSE Early Symposium, expanding the boundaries of education in globalizing times, cultures, identities, citizenship, and cosmopolitanism. We have been doing this since 2011, but this is the first time that we are live streaming. So I want to thank Robert Croy and all of those technical folks who have helped us with the symposium. I especially want to thank Sophie and Brenda and Priya and Mauro for their hard work in putting this symposium together. It was done incredibly quickly and efficiently. Within 2 weeks, we had this move from conception to realization. I also want to thank Dean Mary Kalantzis, our head of department, Jim Anderson, our director of online learning, Chris Mayo, and our director of graduate studies, Yoon Pak, for their continuing support of GSE. As you can see, we have a vigorous and wide-ranging program. The whole purpose of the GSE Symposium is to foreground the wonderful work that students are doing and their extraordinary achievements. We have the scrolling wall, as I am calling it, and I want to see it as a model, a template for extending notice about the work that we do, but also to integrate the work that alumni are doing all the time in developing the word of globalization and global studies in education. This conference, if we may quote one of our distinguished colleagues, is student-driven. GSE students have won numerous awards, including the Graduate College Dissertation Completion Fellowship, the Hardy Dissertation Fellowship, several Bagleys, to name just a few of the awards. The Dissertation Completion Fellowship is very significant. It is very rarely given. We have won it 2 years in a row, and we are the only ones who have won that award in those 2 years. I'm in 2 departments. In the Institute of Communication Research, we put up candidates this year, and we were not successful. So the GSE students, I think, have to be commended for the impressiveness of their scholarship and their record of work and experience. We have master's students online and on campus who are graduating. We have PhD students who are graduating. And many of you have noticed that in interdisciplinary participation with students from ICR, from sociology, from Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese, the English department, etc., we publish a book that we have been working on for almost 3 years. And that book is called Mobilized Identities, Subjectivity, and Cultural Crisis in the Neoliberal Era. We may be bereft of money and resources. We may be the poor child of this local joint in the universe, but we are not bereft of ideas or the will to see transformations in the university and the world. It is our creative energies that will continue to power GSE forward. We continue to build something from nothing. We will continue to seek every opportunity to advance the interests and needs of our students, and we will continue to build on the esprit de corps that defines this group. We will continue to be inclusive, open-minded, and oriented to binding our local circumstances into the promise of a better world. And now let me briefly talk about my theme for today, thinking about cultural studies in a time of recession, the work of aesthetics in modern life. And I want to begin first with Miles Davis and the Stuart Hall project. So at some point, I'm hoping that we get to see the whole of the Stuart Hall project, the film. But very integral to the argument here is the work of aesthetics, the impact of Miles Davis on the idea of the care of the self, on the idea of modernization as a self-authorizing project, which I think is not captured in cultural studies. It's not sustained as part of the way it understands itself. So first, what do we mean by the key terms in the title? Thinking about cultural studies in a time of recession, the work of aesthetics in modern life. What do we mean by recession? What do we mean by culture? What do we mean by aesthetics? By recession, I'm not really referring to the economic downturn particularly. I'm referring to something related but separate. I'm referring to the peculiar diminution of intellectual autonomy, paradoxically, in educational institutions. By culture, I'm not referring to the idea of refined practices or a court of appeal, Matthew Arnold's All That Is Sweetness and Light. I'm referring instead to the production and circulation of meaning and images in stratified contexts, a matter over which in cultural studies we use theory to problematize and unpack taken for granted experiences and practices. We privilege the understanding of context not as a background phenomenon, but as radical relationality and the triangulation of things, of artifacts, language or discourse, practices, texts, events, and structures. And we explore and are deeply interested in the operation of power. We're attentive to inequality. In talking about method, we are not merely talking about techniques, we're talking about an orientation to knowledge. We champion a methodological model of multidisciplinarity, plurality, and complementarity. In talking about aesthetics, I'm referring to strategies of interpretation of human relations and transactions in which style and form are the content of life's self-fashioning. And I note that the circulation of such forms has powerful effects and generates distinctive energies in human affairs that can overrun narrow-mindedness and particularisms, as Cornel West might suggest, beat back or trash narrow-mindedness. As a scholar, I engage with cultural studies as Walter Rodney, who wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, used to say, as a critical friend, and give this radical tradition, which is under siege, critical support. I am not an acolyte. This presentation takes on Paul Willis's Learning to Labor as a foundational text in cultural studies, as a critical point of departure for thinking about the work of aesthetics in the fates and fortunes of the marginalized proletariat in the peripheries of the first and the third worlds. Indeed, nowadays, when I think of learning to labor, I cannot help thinking of the rising tide of denunciations of cultural studies, both from the left and the right, particularly Judith Williamson's extraordinarily blunt rejection of what she calls, quote, left-wing academics picking out strands of subversion in every piece of pop culture, from street style to soap opera. Of course, the academic world is saturated with bad faith punditry, soothsaying, and the empiricist declaration of Cassandras. As perhaps a compensatory reflex, critical theorists are genre-prone. No sooner is a new theoretical line of inquiry announced than a whole new congregation gathers. A field of affiliation is declared, even as its enemies, theorists on the other side, gather, lying in wait in the shadows. Well, the end is always near, at the closest post, reading, writing, researching radicals live precarious lives, and so forth. But there is something nagging in Williamson's statement. It concerns the attack on text and textualism, the opposition of that fatal couplet, text versus experience, and the attendant cynicism about the politics of everyday life and popular investments in taste and style. These are all issues that are raised directly or obliquely in Willis's work in Learning to Labor and his later books, The Ethnographic Imagination and Common Culture. Customarily, cultural studies and neo-Marxist scholars of education writing on urban life have tended to place aesthetics on the boundaries of critical practices, treating aesthetics as a surplus set of practices, a site of the dissipation of energies that can only be made fully relevant when added on to a more concentrated attention to economy and politics. I argue here against this tradition. Instead, I maintain that aesthetic practices now underwrite the fiber, the very fiber of everyday modern life. As Arjun Appadurai usefully points out in Modernity at Large and the Future as Cultural Fact, aesthetic practices are no longer to be simply understood as the practices exclusive to the artist, a maverick or charismatic citizen creating selective images of our past, present, and future, and the future of human existence. But aesthetic practices are linked to the work of the imagination of ordinary people and connected even more earnestly to the work of capitalism and its organization and reorganization on a global scale. I therefore first want to discuss the entanglement of aesthetic discourses in the diffusion of modernization and developmentalism to the third world. Second, I want to point as well to the deepening role of aesthetics in the organization of capitalism in the new millennium in which we live. Third, I discuss briefly the crisis of language that aestheticization of everyday life has precipitated in neo-Marxist efforts to grasp the central dynamics of contemporary societies. The latter development has led to the depreciation of the value and insightfulness of neo-Marxist analysis in our time. We live in an era in which old metaphors associated with Marxism, concepts such as class, economy, state, production, reproduction, resistance, the labor-capital contradiction, reality and fiction, ideology versus truth, materiality and immateriality are being worn down by the transformations of the past decades, in which the saturation of economic and political practices in aesthetic mediations has proceeded full pace. And I conclude the presentation by pointing towards the existential cosmopolitanism latent in third world and minority creations as perhaps offering a way out. Let me now turn to a discussion of the historical context of the integration of aesthetics into commerce. The long shadow of the integration of aesthetics and economics in the elaboration of the capitalist order can be traced back to before the turn of the 20th century in the production of new markets for the ever-expanding range of capitalist goods and services and the generation of consumer durables. These luxuries of personal style were in their everyday utility, if not necessity, expanding middle-class consumption patterns onto the working class. As Stuart Ewan maintains in a book called All-Consuming Images, quote, a growing market in cheap luxury items allowed others, the lower and working classes, to purchase the symbolic accoutrements of status. Within this set of developments, deepening patterns of aestheticization of advertising, the imbuement of commercial products with sensuosity, flair, and feeling, and so forth, generated a leveling effect in the processes of class representation and helped to transform agrarian and immigrant actors into new acquisitive urban subjects. The working class could try on the uniforms of the upper classes, explore their ways of life through the glow and illumination of bric-a-brac, and through consumer credit and loans acquire the imitation furniture, jewelry, and items of leisure that mirrored the aristocratic classes. So a kettle is no longer a kettle. It is almost like an art object in a cabinet of curiosities, which is your kitchen. It's like a culinary museum, as it were. But that this notion of form creating a sensibility towards the world of newness, of connectedness, of being the moda, of being connected to the unfolding and the progress of things. Nutrition is sort of separated from food, and now food is about the way it looks, its texture, etc. Aesthetic practices integrated into economic form were now performing the pedagogy. In other words, I'm talking like Gramsci is talking about hegemony, that these actual lived practices help to convert a group into willfully consuming subjects and citizens, cooperating with dominating systems. Aesthetic practices integrated into economic form were now performing the pedagogy of molding the new subjectivities of the modern age, less in collision with capital in the classical 19th century sense identified by Friedrich Engels in the condition of the working class in England, and more in the besotted communion with the spectacular array of consumer products capitalism has strewn in their wake. Progress, the narrative of one's life trajectory, and imagined futures of linear accumulation would now be marked by the range and capacity of one's consumption. To be a true citizen in the modern society was to be a dedicated consumer. This is what the Frankfurt School theorists really found, that in fact the working class had been compromised, and it had been, in their argument, compromised through culture, and therefore culture had to be the target of of research and explanation by neo-Marxists as to why that revolutionary promise that orthodox Marxism had identified with the working class was not any longer on the cards. This model of progress, proletarianized and internationalized by the middle of the 20th century, would be taken full scale to underdeveloped countries around the globe. Embodied in Coke and Pepsi Cola ads, the family-sized Coca-Cola drink, the cultural translation performed by films, musical, popular songs, etc., that enter the third world through cinema, houses, and especially radio, newspapers, the music industry, cartoons, and the lure of the new sleek-looking surfaces of consumer durables and household electronic appliances. Here, retail and hire purchase practices of the lower orders summarize the needs of the masses for something more materially than was made available to them. These practices of borrowing today and paying tomorrow underline the fuel working class interest in comparative affluence, taste, and leisure, a desire to expand and materialize freedom by codifying taste and style and by integrating the aesthetic and erotic and leisure and pleasure practices into their rigorously subordinated lives defined by industrial parks and agrarian obligations. So in the working class areas in Barbados, whenever somebody acquired a stereo system and hire purchase, you knew because they were playing Marty Robbins or Hank Jones the loudest in the street, or Sam Cooke or something of the kind. Musicals such as The King and I, The Sound of Music, soap operas such as Portia Faces Life, a radio soap opera that was started in the 1940s and later taken up for television broadcasting by CBS in the 1950s, offered aesthetic solutions to the problems of necessity and want in the third world. These popular cultural productions propagated ideas such as the inviolability of contract and the value equivalence involved in the process of exchange of labor for wages. They extended a shimmering imaginary plane of existence, linking the metropolis to the periphery, latent with needs and saturated with unfulfilled desires. These aesthetic works suggested that third world life linked to tradition and agrarian organization and imagination was flawed, oppressive, backward. A neo-Marxist claim as well. This type of Enlightenment narrative was propagated, for example, in highly popularized musicals such as The King and I. Circulated through radio and television, The King and I made popular the modernization dilemma of the old traditions of Siam, what is today Thailand, versus the suppressed wish fulfillment of Siam's people, particularly their capacity for individual action and choice. The King and I ultimately set the capriciousness of the absolutist state against the visions of constitutional democratic national state. The way out of cultural miasma and backwardness to enlightenment was provided in the person of an English school teacher, Anna, who would carry out the work of cultural incorporation and translation, the cultural and philosophical forms of modernization, the right to private property. This is a big deal. If you look at the changes of constitution for independence in the Caribbean, in some cases, between the construct in the parliament in, say, Jamaica or Trinidad, and before the paperwork goes into actual law, which has to go through the Privy Council, 400 changes are made in the constitutional document primarily by multinational business interests who want the right to private property enshrined in the Constitution. They don't want to take it for granted. It has to be a principle that is written into constitutional law. The capacity of workers to sell their labor power and the deification of Western democratic traditions. This is present in mainstream political science, Lucian Pye, Gabriel Arman. All of these scholars are pronouncing the idea that for these countries to take off, whether it's Puerto Rico or wherever, they have to adopt the governmental systems that exist in the metropolitan centers, are all underscored in this musical in which a half-naked king, with Anna's help, must reconstitute his relations to his subjects and retool himself as a comprador agent of capitalism's expansion in Southeast Asia. The aestheticization of the economic capitalism with a human face sold the third world on the modernization theories of Western policy intellectuals such as Daniel Lerner, Harold Lasswell, and William W. Rostow. The passing of traditional societies, as Lerner called it, involved the fearful asymmetry of contractual agreement to exploitation and excavation of the resources of the native and her land, along with the state-enforced guarantee of the privileged status of the right to private property that multinationals and mercantile local elites so intensely crave. So this was projected in the notion of industrialization by invitation. Operation Bootstrap in Puerto Rico was sort of the model that would be perpetuated throughout the region, and the right to property then guaranteed for multinational corporations specific control in the territory that they own, where those areas actually operated by different laws and legal codes than the rest of society. So a country could have the right to combine, the right to unions and so forth, but then the right to unions might not exist in this kind of state within a state. The development gap between the third world and the first could be jumped by the expansion of the consumerist culture of possessive individualism and the wholesale adoption of the infrastructure and industrialized production by overseas territories. Just as new streets were being paved for industrialization by invitation in Puerto Rico and Barbados, the sweet middle-class life of the Brady Bunch and later the Partridge family presented itself through television as the embodiment of the one and only true heaven, as the buoyant endgame in the struggle for happiness. Why couldn't a woman be more like a man, my fair lady? Why couldn't we third world simians or Siams be more like the enlightened West? It was in part this logic of modernization, the embeddedness of the developmentalist project, the dream of plenitude and progress, the work of imagination of ordinary third world people that delivered what the lads in Learning to Labor in Paul Willis's book called the Pakis. All the Asian people in England were called the Pakis by the oppositional working class. All the West Indians were called the Jamaicans. To the land of the lads in pursuit of the holy grail of the better life and the material rewards of capitalism. So there's a pull that is taking place as people pursue their dreams of modernization. What we confront in the ocular opposition of the immigrant other to the lads in Learning to Labor is this abridgment of a continuous line or movement of disembeddedness, displacement, and transformation in an imaginative and spatial geography that extends the aspirations of the Jamaicans, the West Indians, the Pakistanians, the Indians, the Bangladeshis, from the periphery to the beachheads of Bristol, Manchester, and elsewhere in England. So in theory, the working classes of the different contexts had grounds for alliance. Why was it that the theorists sought to create the British white working class as the trans-historical class without reference to this group, or seeing this group actually as a kind of marginal element in the story? This full significance, the full significance of what this movement would mean in the changing terms of globalization was indeed far more fully recognized in the popular films, The Full Monty and Billy Elliot, and more recently, This Is England. To understand these dynamics more clearly, we must now turn to the consideration of the role of aesthetics in everyday life. The role of aesthetics in everyday life has deepened in the last few decades with the rising importance of computerization and media-driven technologies. The work of aesthetics is not simply now embodied in the selling of messages and images, but in the very construction of products and constituencies of affiliation in the new millennium. The strategies of integration of modern subjects into modern institutions. It is that whole area of stylization of the self, self-regulation, surveillance, and the self-management of everyday life that Foucault discusses in the History of Sexuality volumes. But the processes of aestheticization also reach deeper into the marketing and circulation of goods and services. The proliferation of labels, branding, and the redirection of difference and diversity towards the new vending machines of choice. As the author of No Logo, Naomi Klein, insisted some years ago, it is the aesthetics of entrepreneurial identities and labels, logos, and brands that have displaced the manufacture of products as the heart and soul of what makes post-Fordist capitalism tick. And increasingly, the university is seeing itself as ticking that way. The astronomical growth, says Klein, in the wealth and cultural influence of multinational corporations over the last 15 years can arguably be traced back to a single seemingly innocuous idea developed by management theories in the mid-80s, that successful corporations must primarily produce brands, not products. Everywhere, smart capital is running away from the materialization of dense product inventories, costly overheads, and static models. Does this sound familiar? Static models of factory organization, and opting instead for the cultivation of new bonds of consumer affiliation and labeling, relying on the faithful consumer to spawn markets by parading the labels of branded distinction in their natural habitats. The consumer's body and its extension by handheld machines, such as the mobile phone, the iPad, the laptop, and the iPod, have become the new interactive canvases of commodity fetishism. And it is in this framework of cultural oversupply that the modern consumer tries on new identities and directs and redirects practices of self-correction and self-modulation. Transnational corporations such as Starbucks and Nike now brand new ecumenical communities with their labels like so many tattoos on the global social body. And so ethnic, class, and gendered communities are now coalescing around practices of consumption and patterns of taste rather than around production relations or ancestry or geography or biology. The language of the new aesthetically branded world now registers the new ecumenical orders of feeling and the organization of affect and taste. As Manuel Castells tells us in The Rise of the Networked Society, these ecumenical orders overlap with traditional collectivities of class or race or gender and nationality, but in the most frenetic and unpredictable ways. The new aestheticism has generated a new cannibalism as the modern actor seeks refuge in ever more savage intensities and hybridities. Attachment to subject positions are now more precariously saturated. This shifting terrain of identity and affiliation has overtaken neo-Marxist scholarship in education. Categories and metaphors that had been relied upon in the past to unscramble social relations and dynamics now seem challenged by the new circumstances of contemporary education, work, and leisure. The formation of interests, distinctions, needs, and desires seem now to be so susceptible to an endless array of permutations. The framework of analysis that linked education to capitalist employers, to factories, to the nation state, and so forth, is no longer serviceable, as the coordination of economic and symbolic production is now re-articulated along multiple sites in a global process of marketing, branding, and outsourcing of goods and services. And work has been extended, as Melissa Gregg argues, from the workplace to the intimacy of the home. Much of the limitation of contemporary neo-Marxist discourses in addressing the dynamic movement of cultural and economic capital today has to do with the tendency towards a residual structural realism that both reifies and privileges notions of an authentic working class, a territorially bounded nation state, and an economy understood in terms of the language of commodity production and accumulation. What these theorists need to recognize, as Klein suggests, are the new trends that point to a deepening reorganization of capital. Within these developments, symbolic mobilization is now an ascendant practice. Capitalist industries are divesting their inventories of commodities and investing in cultivating label affiliation, brand loyalty, and esprit de corps among the consuming population. Style and taste are now driving the economic as ecumenical communities are fabricated in the uniforms of Nike or Gap or Hilfiger. It is the royal consumer whose newly dressed body serves as a mobile billboard for the corporate enterprise of Nike, Starbucks, Adidas, and so forth. The new consumer is the new citizen whose aesthetics of existence are now ever more deeply imbricated in a universalization of the entrepreneurial spirit and the propagation of the redemptive neoliberal value of choice. Nowhere do we see this cultural morphing of capital in the citizen more than in schooling. Students now approach their school and university curricula as a savvy consumer shopping for courses. And courses are weighted by educational administrations on the basis of their drawing power, the numbers of enrollees per class. We have reached a stage in this new millennium where the old conflict versus consensus metaphors do not seem to apply. Instead of models based on conflict and resistance, increasingly social groups are being defined by overwhelming patterns of transnational hybridities, new forms of association and affiliation that seem to flash on the surface of life rather than to plunge deeper down into some neo-Marxist substructure. Paul Willis's nationally and geographically inscribed lads are now being replaced by Jenny Kelly's Afro-Canadian youth. This is in her book, Borrowed Identities, who are patching together their identities from the surfeit of signs and symbols crossing the border in the electronic relays of US television, popular music, and cyber culture. Post-apartheid South African youth now assign more value to markers of taste, according to Nadine Dolby. Levi and Gap jeans, Nikes or Adidas, rap or rave, than ancestry and place in their elaboration of the new criteria of ethnic affiliation. All these developments are turning the old materialism versus idealism debate on the head. It is the frenetic application of forms of existence, forms of life, the dynamic circulation and strategic deployment of style, the application of social aesthetics that now govern political rationalities and corporate mobilization and calculations in our time. The new representational technologies are the centers of public instruction, providing the forum for the work of the imagination of the great masses of the people to order their past and present and plot their futures. The massive work of textual production is a socially extended project producing the cultural citizen in the new international division of labor. I want to end here by pointing to powerful visionary energies. I think here of the work of the French cultural theorist Jacques Attali in his book Noise. He addresses the deeply condensed, even prophetic meaning circulating in contemporary aesthetic work. On the other side of the circulation of forms consolidating market power has been the aesthetic works of the post-colonial imagination, their critiques of capitalism and the parables of modernization. These visionary frameworks parallel the rise of cultural studies in England and the Frankfurt School in Germany. They also run against the strong modernization push of US policy onto the third world. Much of the value of these alternative aesthetics has fallen outside the prism of cultural studies analysis. The work of painters such as Aubrey Williams, Guyana Dreaming, the novels of Wilson Harris, such as The Palace of the Peacock, setting the test of the integration of opposites, colonizer and colonized, in Donne's Dream Kingdom, or the character of Idiot Nameless, of Companions of the Day and Night, who has the fallen sickness in Mexico City, plunging into pre-Columbian past. The work of Gordon Bennett, questioning the narratives of settlement, enlightenment, and modernization in his dialogue with the Haitian-American artist Jean-Michel Basquiat. The movement and alternative reference of African-American music within the intimate platform of the Black Atlantic is still to receive a proper and meaningful documentation in cultural studies. The rise of dependency theory in Latin America, Dos Santos, Chicolte, Cardoso, Dorfman, and Gunder Frank, focused in Chile and in some ways embodied in the poetry of Pablo Neruda and Gabriela Mistral. The great irony here was that these alternative visions paralleled the moment of the rise of theory of cultural resistance associated with the British white working class, and in the scholarship of its leading purveyors on either side of the Atlantic, from Willis, McRoby, and Yang to Giroux. It is to this post-colonial aesthetic work that we might choose to turn for edification on emancipation. The great longing for what Ornette Coleman called harmolodics, deployed in his album In All Languages. Miles Davis's modal experimentation in Sketches of Spain, or Sun Ra's ecological admonition that space is the place, represent the channeling of voices of an alternative existential cosmopolitanism that might put our present historical moment in perspective in our quest for transcendence and transformation. And I want to end with, as I began, with Miles Davis again. The point that I'm making here is that this aesthetic is crucial to the communication of modernization and what it means. That this performance is actually improvisational. It's in a studio in which the film Escalator to the Scaffold, Ascenseur pour l'échafaud of Louis Malle. These images are being projected and Miles Davis is responding. It's one take. And you cannot understand New Wave French film without the presence of jazz. You cannot understand actually modern film without this kind of presence. And the problem that I then have with cultural studies as a critical friend is that these ideas are in the current era in which they're focusing their direction on the British working class, and yet there's no attempt to integrate this aesthetic work into meaningful analysis and what it might suggest for questions of transformation, change, the understanding of urban or industrial life, etc. So I'll stop there and entertain questions or comments, or if we are behind time, we can do that informally, etc. But thank you very much.